Welcome to the podcast. I'm Tim and I'm a composer. Have a listen to episode 0 to find out what this podcast is all about, or just keep listening to this episode and we'll dive right in. Previously, I've looked at Beethoven's First Symphony from 1800, and then Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier from around 1720, and also Guido d'Arezzo, the story of Guido d'Arezzo, who gave us the very beginnings of musical notation around the year 1000. Well, today we're jumping forward to 1772, and we're looking at a symphony by Joseph Haydn, Symphony number 45 to be precise, and it's known as The Farewell. It's an odd title for a symphony, isn't it? You might expect something like the heroic or the pastoral or something grand. The farewell sounds a bit melancholy, I suppose, a bit final. And when you hear what happens at the end of this symphony, you understand why it has that nickname. But there's a story behind it. A rather wonderful story involving homesick musicians, a fabulously wealthy prince, a remote palace in the Hungarian countryside, and a composer who found a way to send a message without saying a single word. Let me describe what happens at the end of this symphony. The fourth movement, because it's in 4 movements, which was conventional by this time for a symphony. So the fourth movement begins with a presto, which means as fast as possible, and it's turbulent, fiery music in the rather unusual key of F sharp minor. It sounds like a perfectly good ending to a symphony. Fast, fiery, turbulent. But then, after what feels like a conclusion, an ending, the music, well, it stops, but then it carries on, and something unexpected happens. A slow section begins, an adagio. Gentle, rather tender, slow. And in this slow section, the musicians, one by one, stop playing. And as each musician finishes their part, if you're watching them, you might see them blow out the candle on their music stand, pack up their instruments and walk off the stage. Very strange. Here's what that ending sounds like. It's not at all what you'd expect from a symphony. Symphonies are supposed to end with a bang, aren't they? With a great sort of climax, a rousing finale, everyone playing together in triumph, not with the musicians quietly packing up and walking away, walking off stage. So why did Haydn write it this way? And why is it called The Farewell? Well, the title isn't actually one that Haydn gave it himself. It came later as a nickname once the story behind the symphony became known. And the story is this. It was a kind of musical protest, a polite but unmistakable message from the court musicians to their employer, Prince Nikolaus Esterházy, who was one of the richest men in Europe, well, the world in fact. The message was simple: we want to go home. But to understand why the musicians needed to send a message like that, and why Haydn had to be so clever about it, we need to go back a bit. We need to understand who Prince Nikolaus was, what kind of life Haydn led, working for him, and what had brought them all to this remote palace in Hungary in the autumn of 1772. Prince Nikolaus I, Prince Esterházy, was known in his day as Der Prachtliebender. Apologies to any Germans listening, my German pronunciation is probably terrible, but anyway, Der Prachtliebender, which translates as the magnificent, or perhaps the splendor-loving. And he earned that title, that nickname, through spectacularly lavish spending. He was one of the super rich of his day, thanks to owning huge amounts of productive, valuable land. He was reputedly even richer than the Austrian emperor himself, one of the wealthiest nobles in the entire Habsburg Empire. It's hard to make comparisons to wealthy people from today, but, think of a billionaire. That's wouldn't be far from the mark. So he was born in December 1714, and he became prince in 1762 when his older brother, Paul Anton, died without children. The great German poet Goethe met him in 1764 and described him as not tall, although well-formed, lively, and at the same time eminently decorous, without pride or coldness. So a man who carried his enormous wealth with a certain sort of grace, it seems. And what did he do with all that money? Well, among other things, he built a palace, or rather, he transformed what had been a simple hunting lodge into one of the most extravagant buildings in Europe, well, really, the world. It was called Esterházy, and it sat in rural Hungary, near a village called Fertod, in swampy land near the Neusiedler Sea. Again, apologies to any Hungarians listening for my terrible Hungarian pronunciation. Well, the construction of this palace took 22 years, from 1762 to 1784. When it was finally completed, it had 126 rooms in the main palace alone, nearly 200 hectares of grounds, an opera house that seated no fewer than 400 people, a separate marionette theatre, and a library with almost 22,000 volumes. The whole thing cost 13 million Austrian gulden, which I've heard called an astronomical sum. But how astronomical? From what I've managed to find out about the equivalent in today's money of a single gulden or florin of the mid-18th century, this palace's price tag would be in the hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. Not many houses built at that cost today, of course, but actually one was. Larry Ellison, the founder, the CEO of Oracle, Larry Ellison's home cost around $200 million. So thinking of Prince Esterházy as a billionaire, or what today would be a billionaire, is not far from the mark. So this palace, Esterházy, was designed partly in homage to Versailles, which Nikolaus had visited in 1764, and it became known as the Hungarian Versailles. Versailles, of course, being the grand palace just outside Paris in France. Now, here's the thing about Esterházy. It was beautiful, it was grand, it was a showcase for the prince's wealth and taste, but it was also basically in the middle of nowhere, about 40 kilometres from the family's main residence at Eisenstadt, which was itself quite a provincial place, and about 80 to 100 kilometres from Vienna. Versailles, by contrast, was less than a day's ride from downtown centre of Paris. Esterházy was genuinely remote. Prince Nikolaus loved it there. He evidently did not enjoy Vienna, and he spent up to 10 months of the year at this so-called summer palace. 10 months! So it wasn't really a summer palace at all, it was where he lived most of the time, in the middle of nowhere. So this is where it becomes important for our story. The musicians working for the prince, the court orchestra, they had to be there too. Wherever the prince went, his musicians, his personal orchestra went too. And there was a rule. The musicians were not allowed to bring their families. Their wives and children had to stay behind in Eisenstadt. The musicians and other staff, mostly men, had to spend months at this beautiful but remote castle. So imagine you're a musician in this orchestra. Your employer, one of the richest men in the world, decides to spend most of the year at this remote palace in the Hungarian countryside. You have to go with him. Your wife can't come, and you don't know from one season to the next exactly how long you'll be away. Usually, the prince would return to Eisenstadt in October, but in the autumn of 1772, he announced that he was going to stay at Esterházy for several weeks longer than usual. Several weeks longer. For men who hadn't seen their wives and their families in months, this was devastating news. So where does Haydn fit into all of this? Joseph Haydn signed his contract as Vice Kapellmeister, that is, assistant music director, to the court on the 1st of May 1761, and he was 29 years old. Okay, he was quite young then, still in his 20s, just about. But one doesn't simply appear from nowhere and sign a contract as Vice Kapellmeister of one of the richest men in the world. Haydn actually had a very humble start in life. His dad made wheels and was also the local marketplace supervisor, and his mum worked as a cook. He grew up in a small village called Rohrau in Austria, right on the border with Hungary. His parents couldn't read music, but his dad was a keen folk musician and had taught himself to play the harp. Haydn later told stories about how the family and their neighbours would gather and sing together, in the evening perhaps, after work. And perhaps as a result of these occasions, young Joseph's parents noticed that he was very good at music. And right from the age of 6, he started serious musical training at the nearby town of Hainburg, and he never again, from that moment, lived with his parents. Quite strange to understand from today, but think what that must have been like. To this new life, away from his parents, for Haydn was apparently not easy. He recalled often being hungry and mocked for his filthy clothes. But musically, he impressed, and by 1739, so he's only 7 at this point, he was brought to the attention of Georg Reuter the Younger, who was director of music at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. Huge cathedral right in the middle of Vienna, the heart of musical life at the time. So this Georg Reuter the Younger just happened to be passing through Hainburg, looking for choir boys, as you do, and Haydn had an audition, passed, and in 1740, so he's now 8, he moved to Vienna as a chorister, and he spent the next 9 years there. He also played the violin, the keyboard, and had lessons in various typical school subjects, like Latin and so on. Strangely, he only ever had 2 lessons in music theory, but being, right at the centre of music in Europe at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, I guess he was able to absorb a huge amount. Very musically gifted, you could just absorb it, just take it in. So Haydn also complained of being hungry in Vienna too, and would try to get picked for concerts with aristocratic audiences because they would lay on some food for those and he could go and get some of it. In 1749, when he's 17 by this point, he can no longer sing the high parts for trebles, and after a prank involving cutting off the pigtail of a fellow chorister, he was beaten and thrown out onto the streets of Vienna, and that was the end of his career at the cathedral. He was taken in by a family friend and began a precarious career as a freelance musician. Some teaching, a few gigs as an organist and as an accompanist, and even busking, singing on the streets. Over the years, he managed to gain a good reputation as a decent musician. And through studying books on counterpoint, he taught himself to compose. He even managed to put on a comic opera called The Limping Devil in 1753 when he was 21, but it got shut down almost straight away by the censors for including so-called offensive remarks. Nonetheless, Haydn managed to secure the best kind of work, which was at aristocratic courts. And he was asked to write music, which was very much liked by the patrons. Eventually, by recommendation from one aristocrat to another, he landed a full-time job with one Count Maurzin in 1757, so he's now 25. His job was Kapellmeister, music director, and he led and composed for a small orchestra that the Count kept. And now that he had a secure job, he married to a woman named Maria Keller. But actually, it didn't work out that well, and they both ended up taking lovers, so the law of the time didn't permit them to separate. By 1761, Count Maurzin got into financial difficulties, and he dismissed his orchestra. He got rid of it to save money. Disaster for Haydn, but luckily, he was quickly poached by Prince Paul Anton of the immensely wealthy Esterházy family, who had heard Haydn's work for Count Maurzin. In 1762, Paul Anton died, and his younger brother Nikolaus I inherited this talented young Kapellmeister. And so this was Haydn's life for the next 30 years, during which he was able to create some of the greatest works of music of the day, and of all time in fact, one of which we're going to explore today. His contract of employment with Paul Anton and then with Nikolaus Esterházy is quite revealing about Haydn's status. It explicitly established that he was to be received and treated as a house staff member. So that's a servant, in other words. He was required to wear a uniform when the orchestra performed, white stockings, white shirt, with either a pigtail or a tie wig, and the contract specifies thoroughly powdered. He had to wait in the prince's antechamber morning and afternoon to receive orders. He was responsible for composing music as commanded, maintaining all of the instruments, supervising and disciplining the other musicians, instructing singers, and resolving any disputes without troubling the prince. And there was a particularly important clause about his compositions. He was bound, the contract said, not to let such compositions be communicated to any other party, much less be copied, but they shall remain for his use only. In other words, everything Haydn wrote belonged to the prince. He couldn't sell his music to publishers, he couldn't share it with other musicians, he couldn't build a reputation outside the Esterházy court. This only changed in 1779, when a renegotiated contract finally allowed him to write for other people, and to sell his music to publishers. But in 1772, when our story takes place, Haydn was still bound by these restrictions. So his salary started at 400 Rhineland florins per year, which rose over time to around 782 by 1763. So it's hard to convert that really to today's money to give you a picture of what that means, but at the lower end, this is about typical for a member of the emerging sort of professional middle class, similar to a schoolmaster, for example. When the old Kapellmeister Gregor Werner died in March 1766, Haydn was promoted. He became full Kapellmeister, the top musical position in the household, and quite well paid by now too. Now, despite all these restrictions and the remote location, Haydn later described his time at Esterházy with a certain fondness. In a letter to his friend Marianne von Genzinger, he wrote, "My prince was content with all my works. I received approval. I was set apart from the world. There was nobody in my vicinity to confuse and annoy me in my course, and so I had to be original." That phrase is often quoted, "I had to be original." The isolation forced him to experiment, to develop his own musical voice, because there was no one else around to imitate or to please except for the prince. It's a silver lining, I suppose, for a creative and experimental artist to what must have been a rather lonely existence. And Haydn's personal life was not that happy either. He had married, as I say, Maria Anna Theresia Keller in November 1760, although he had actually really been in love with her younger sister, Teresa, who had entered a convent. The marriage was, by all accounts, a complete disaster. Maria Anna was reportedly quarrelsome, jealous, had no interest in his music. Haydn complained that she doesn't care a straw whether her husband is an artist or a cobbler. They had no children, and by the 1770s, they were essentially estranged. She stayed in Eisenstadt and later at the spa town of Baden for her rheumatism, and she never came to Esterházy. So Haydn understood some loneliness. He understood what it meant to be separated from home, from family, from any kind of normal domestic life. When the other musicians came to him in the autumn of 1772, apparently thrown into utter consternation, as one early biographer put it, asking him to somehow persuade the prince to let them go home, Haydn would have sympathised with that. Now, I should say something about Prince Nikolaus's relationship with music, because it's important for understanding why Haydn's musical message could work at all. Nikolaus was intensely musical, very interested in music. He played 3 instruments: cello, viola da gamba, and the baritone. The baritone, now that's a rather obscure instrument today, similar to a viola da gamba, which I suppose is also a little bit obscure perhaps. That looks a bit like a cello, a modern cello, without the little metal pole coming out of the bottom of it. So you hold it between your legs, hold it steady between your legs while you play it. So the baritone looks a little bit like that, but it's got extra strings in the box that resonate when you play. It's some people compare it a little bit to a hurdy-gurdy, and it's really quite tricky to play. And the prince was very protective of his expertise on it. There's a story that when Haydn tried to learn the baritone himself, Nikolaus told him, "Haydn, you should know better. In other words, stick to composing." The prince took an active interest in the music performed at his court. He once formally reprimanded Haydn in 1765 for not composing enough baritone music. Haydn responded by writing 126 trios for baritone between 1765 and 1775. 126 in 10 years. Nice sort of dedication to the cause for you. Despite this sort of occasional friction, perhaps, Prince Nikolaus became Haydn's greatest patron. He frequently gave Haydn gold ducats for individual compositions. Now, a ducat was worth several florins, perhaps about the same as one day's wage. So it's a nice bonus. When Haydn's house burnt down in 1768, the prince had it rebuilt. And when it burned down again in 1776, he rebuilt it for him again. And when the prince learned that one of the sopranos in the prince's opera company, who is called Luigia Polzelli, when he learned that she was Haydn's mistress, his lover, he reversed an early decision to dismiss her, perhaps for not being very good at singing. She was able to stay, and she was able to be Haydn's companion, even though she wasn't a very good singer, and the whole idea of perhaps having lovers on the side was a little bit frowned upon. But nonetheless, the prince enabled this to happen. So the point of this is that Nikolaus was not just a wealthy sort of dilettante who happened to employ musicians. just to show off with them. The prince clearly wanted Haydn to be happy working for him. So he was a musician himself. He understood music from the inside. He could read scores. He understood the conventions of the time, the musical conventions, and see, he would notice when a composer did something unusual. This sophistication, I suppose, is absolutely essential. When Haydn sent his musical message in the Farewell Symphony, the prince was equipped to understand it, and he was inclined to be receptive to it. Before we get to the Farewell Symphony itself, let me say a few words about what a symphony actually was in 1772, and what audiences would have expected from one. The symphony as a form had evolved from the Italian opera overture, which is called a Sinfonia Avanti l'Opera, and this was a short orchestral piece played before the curtain goes up. Over the course of the 18th century, these overtures broke free from opera and became independent pieces that you could listen to by themselves. By 1772, the typical symphony now had 4 movements. These would normally be, by convention, a fast opening movement, followed by a slow movement, then a minuet and trio, sort of pair of dances, and then a fast finale to finish with. And the whole thing would have lasted somewhere between sort of 15 to 25 minutes, and the orchestra playing it would have been about 20, 25 players, something like that. Mostly strings, a few woodwinds, a couple of horn players, that sort of thing. You sometimes hear this period in history described as the classical period of musical history, and Haydn, along with Mozart, are usually named as the leading figures of the classical period. But in 1772, Mozart was only 16 years old, had not yet written most of his most important works. I think 16, okay, you might think that's quite young, but Mozart, and there will be a podcast about Mozart, I am sure, was tremendously gifted at a young age. But, by 16, he had many of his most important works yet to write. And the term classical is really a later label. It was given to this time in history in the following century, in the 19th century, partly as a way of making that kind of music seem more grounded in history. At the time, people didn't think of themselves as writing classical music. They were simply writing music, although music of a culture and kind that evolved through the continuous process of literature, of reading and writing music, passing techniques and ideas down generations of composers over 7 or 8 centuries up to this point. A better term for what Haydn was doing specifically in the early 1770s might be Sturm und Drang, which is German for storm and stress. It's borrowed from a literary movement, although interestingly the play, now this is a little bit complicated, bear with me, the play that gives this movement, Sturm und Drang, its name, was written by a writer called Klinger, and it wasn't actually written until 1776, several years after Haydn's stormiest symphonies that really epitomised this style. So the music came first. The style, as epitomised in Klinger's play, emphasised intense emotions, individualism, rebellion against rationalism. Klinger's play explored themes of passion, conflict against the backdrop of the American Revolution. So there's a shared artistic temperament between writers and composers across musical and written literature at this time as well as at other times over history. Haydn wrote a number of symphonies in this turbulent style between 1768 and 1773. Symphony number 26, called Lamentazione. Symphony 44, called Trauer, meaning mourning. Symphony 49, La Passione. So these are intense, emotionally charged works, often in minor keys, full of sudden dynamic contrasts and unexpected harmonic turns. One scholar described the Farewell Symphony as possibly the darkest, most turbulent, most bizarre symphony written up to that time. So, when Prince Nikolaus sat down to hear a new symphony by his Kapellmeister in the autumn of 1772, he would have had certain expectations. He might have been expecting to hear something turbulent, something dramatic, but also within certain conventions, the usual conventions of the symphony at that time. 4 movements, fast, slow, minuet, fast, and a satisfying conclusion with everyone playing together. And what he got was something quite different. The Farewell Symphony itself is in F-sharp minor. Now, that might not mean very much to you if you're not a musician, so let me explain why this matters. F-sharp minor, it's a key with 3 sharps in its key signature. So it's actually therefore an awkward key for many instruments, particularly the natural horns of the 18th century. Now, the horn that Haydn's players used was a valveless instrument, didn't have those little keys on it to help change the pitch. It could only play the notes of the natural harmonic series, which meant that to play in different keys, you had to swap out sections of the tubing, and the bits of tubing you would swap in and out are called crooks. There was a standard set of crooks for common keys, like F major, E flat major, D major, G major, and so on. So here, for example, is the harmonic series in F. As a brass player, you can control which note sounds by varying the pressure and tightness of your lips and directing the angle of the airflow into the instrument. That might sound a bit sort of complicated and hard to imagine, but it's really almost the first thing that you learn to do as a brass player once you've learned to make a sound with a brass instrument. You can try the same yourself, perhaps by buzzing your lips into a long cardboard tube or a length of hose pipe if you like. And your neighbours might look at you a bit strangely, but nonetheless, if you're lucky, if you do it just right, you might be able to reach 2 or 3 notes of the harmonic series. Most real instruments, brass instruments, can access 8 or 9 of these notes in the harmonic series. But the way a horn in particular is constructed, the player can access more of the notes near the top of the series, where they are closer together, giving access to fragments of scales, for example, very useful when it comes to playing music. In order to access a wider range of notes, the length of the brass tube needs to change. So that in turn changes the harmonic series to one beginning on a different note, based on a different fundamental note. On a horn of Haydn's time and earlier, the player changed the length of the overall brass tube by swapping out, a length of that tubing. And this swappable thing, called a crook. Players owned a set of crooks, giving access to different keys, different harmonic series, and therefore they were able to play in a whole variety of different keys. By the way, brass instruments later had valves or keys then that automatically swapped these lengths of tubing around so that the player didn't have to keep, swapping them in and out and spending time doing that, possibly clattering away at the back of the orchestra, and removing the need for that with valves. This greatly increased the ability of brass instruments to take part in more of the music, and that in turn meant that composers could write different sounds, different colours. As the music moves through different keys, for example, the player who has a valved or keys instrument doesn't need to pull out and push in the different bits of tube, and that takes time. So, later composers could use the horns and trumpets much more frequently. Now, trombones, however, were not a regular feature of Haydn's orchestra, but they had been around for a good while by this point, and they work differently. The length of the brass tube is altered with the trombone's slide, meaning there's no need for crooks or valves. Now, this innovation actually was copied to the horn occasionally. Bach, it's believed, had access to a player with a slide horn, but the higher pitch of the horn and the closeness of the pitches together in the bit of the harmonic series that the horn has easiest access to, that makes it quite a tricky thing for the player. But you can find some amazing YouTube videos of the slide horn, if you like. Anyway, I digress. Back to Haydn's Symphony in F-sharp minor, and Haydn's horn players, of which there are 2 required in this symphony. So I've said that the standard crooks gave horns at this time easy access to various common keys, D, F, and G major, but there was no standard F-sharp crook, or a crook for any other key that would be suitable for playing in F-sharp minor. In addition, when writing in a minor key, it's common for the music to switch to the major. So in this case, that's F-sharp major. And if you're a musician, you're already wincing at that. So this key, F-sharp major, has 6 sharps in the key signature, meaning that all except for one note of the 7-note scale is sharpened. You've got to remember to do that. So it's honestly, that's quite challenging even for musicians of today when they're faced with something in F-sharp major. They might sort of shake their heads and roll their eyes and that sort of thing. Nobody wrote symphonies in F-sharp minor and used the key of F-sharp minor or F-sharp major at this time in the 18th century. So any music at all, in fact, in F-sharp major was extraordinarily rare before the 19th century. The Esterházy orchestra must have been really very good, technically excellent, to be able to pull this off. In fact, according to a survey that I've seen of all surviving symphonies of the 18th century, and there are hundreds of them, the Farewell Symphony is the only one known to us in the whole 18th century written in this key. The only one in the entire century when hundreds and hundreds of these were being written. So how did Haydn's horn players manage to play? Well, we have documentary evidence of the solution. In the Esterházy archives, there's a purchase order dated 22nd of October 1772, signed by Haydn for two special, now apologies for my pronunciation here, but two special halbtonige Kronbogen. Halbtonige Kronbogen, which, you probably won't understand even what I'm saying, even if you can speak German, but that translates as half-step slides. These were custom-made extensions, that slightly lengthened the horn's tubing, allowing players to convert their G crooks to reach F sharp, making them slightly longer, tuning them down a semitone or half step from G to F sharp, and giving access to the harmonic series on F sharp, which is handy for both F sharp minor and F sharp major. The local blacksmith at Esterházy had to make them specially. Now, this purchase order is important for two reasons. First, it proves that when the symphony was being prepared, it was in autumn 1772. And second, it shows that Haydn deliberately chose a so-called impossible key, one that required special equipment to be manufactured. He was making a statement with this from the very first note, or before even the very first note. So let me walk you through the symphony itself. I'm going to play some examples on the piano. Obviously, when you go and listen to a recording, you'll be hearing an orchestra. The first movement is marked allegro assai, meaning very fast. It's in 3/4 time and it's turbulent. It's agitated music in F sharp minor. Sounds like this. Now, throughout nearly all of this movement, the music uses this arpeggio figure, moving by leaps. Nothing that really resembles a melody moving by step. It works in a stormy, agitated way through various keys, very unsettled. However, there is something unusual in this movement. Something really very mysterious. After we've heard this arpeggio theme many times through different keys, and Haydn is, developing it and using it, quite suddenly everything stops. Everything goes quiet. And there's a little passage of music that's almost dreamlike, perhaps. It doesn't feel like it belongs in the movement at all, and it's in a key that isn't used in the rest of the movement, D major. The turbulent music suddenly lands on an F sharp major chord, collapses into silence, and from this silence emerges a completely different kind of music. Sort of wispy, floating in D major. You could describe it as music of a different world. And then it trails off into uncertainty, just into nothing. And then the turbulent F sharp minor music returns. So here's how this interlude sounds. Now, later in the symphony, we're reminded again a little bit of this D major material, this D major music, in the farewell adagio, but only the sort of faintest of reminders, like a bit of an echo, a hint. This D major music is heard once, and once only, in this first movement. But with these hints, Haydn is creating connections across the whole work, telling us a story through sort of references and back references and little hints and little, Easter eggs, I suppose. Now, this technique of bringing back earlier material is often associated with Beethoven, who really pioneered it and really made it famous, particularly in the Fifth Symphony. But Haydn was doing it here in 1772, which is really very radical, very new, very experimental. So, on to the second movement. This is a slow movement, as you'd conventionally expect. It's an adagio, it's in A major. It's gentle and songful, and here's how it goes. That's followed by the third movement, a minuet in F sharp major with a trio section, so two dances put together. And there's something interesting here. The trio seems to quote a Gregorian chant that Haydn was apparently fond of. He used it in a previous symphony, number 26, also written for Prince Esterházy back in 1768. Now, there's a musicologist called Thomas Tolley who has connected this theme to the Tenebrae ritual in the Catholic Church, a Holy Week service where candles are extinguished one by one as darkness falls. So even before the finale, where we literally see people turning out candles one by one, even before then, there's a sort of a symbolic hidden connection to candles and to departure. I wonder if the prince spotted this, whether he knew the music that Haydn had written for him so well that he could have spotted this reference, this lamentation within the performance. Bearing in mind, he wouldn't yet have even heard the fourth movement and seen the musicians putting out their lights. But Haydn is very subtly setting up something here, and the prince, a real fan, and possibly even a bit of a musical train spotter, especially when it came to Haydn's music, he might well have noticed that something was going on here. Anyway, here's what the third movement sounds like. And then we go into the fourth movement. It begins with a presto, which means as fast as possible, in F sharp minor. Here's what it sounds like. So you can hear that's nervous, it's angry music, it's frustrated. Arpeggios of the first movement are there as well. It sounds like a perfectly good, expected ending to a Sturm und Drang symphony. Well, it sounds like that at first, but we've been set up, and the prince might have been perplexed here. The first movement is in F sharp minor, the second in A major, which is the relative major, has the same key signature as F sharp minor, and then the third is in F sharp major. But the finale begins again in F sharp minor. Well, then we're off on a roller coaster of keys, just like the first movement. But then it breaks off suddenly. The fast and stormy dramatic music stops, just like it did in the first movement. Do you remember when the interruptions for that strange, otherworldly interlude? Well, it does the same sort of trick again here. And at this very similar moment in the finale, we're interrupted and we get something new. So we're now in A major, by the way, and we head in this new material into F sharp major, that terrifying key with 6 sharps, copying the same pattern we've heard before. And we know this is strange and unexpected, but at the same time, we've been led, perhaps subconsciously, to expect it through the repetition of the cycle of keys throughout the whole symphony. So you can really see the connections between movements, which was a very new thing to do. So the fast final movement is suddenly halted, not for that mysterious D major interlude from the first movement, but for something new. And so the adagio begins, the farewell. This is what it sounds like. The mood has transformed entirely. It's in A major now, gentle triple meter with triplet figures, a great contrast to the angry and frustrated music before. Is this new music, do you think, related to that D major interlude because of the setup being so similar? It's a different tune, for sure, but it sounds somehow familiar. Now, as a composer, I'm completely intrigued by this, and I want to figure out how they are so different and yet seem somehow similar. So have a listen. Here's the D major bit from the first movement. And here's the adagio theme. Now, the thing that's similar between them is that Haydn uses these so-called leaning notes, where you have a note not quite in the current harmony, leaning into the harmony and resolving into it. It's got a sort of yearning, caressing kind of feel, I think. And to me, it's very clear that Haydn is referring, I think, in this to the wives and the girlfriends back home. They're distant and memory only, but a very fond memory. It's actually really possibly quite an erotic memory. Remember, this is a group of pent-up young men here, Haydn included. And it's presented in contrast to stormy and angry, frustrated music. Even without the drama of the ending to this symphony, this is already, I think, a very clear message, setting up these contrasts. But we do indeed have a dramatic ending. The first time a piece of visual theatre, or pantomime, I suppose, is introduced to a symphony. Very, very unusual. In the score, the musical score, Haydn wrote nichts mehr at certain points, meaning no more. And this is where each musician stops playing and leaves. The order of departure is quite precise. First the oboe and the second horn, who each play a little solo before leaving together. Then the bassoon, who leaves without a solo, but it's the first time in the symphony that the bassoon has its own independent line. Then the second oboe and the first horn. Then the double bass, who gets an unexpectedly long and rather comic solo before departing. Even this is remarkable. I don't think any composer had given the double bass a solo in a symphony before this time. But everyone gets their little solo, and we're drawing attention to the orchestra being made up of individuals, of characters, in a very visual way. During this bass solo, the music transitions from A major back to F sharp major. We've been set up to expect this in the rest of the symphony, through this cycle, this cyclical, travelling through different keys. So this is a sign, which perhaps you might only pick up a bit subconsciously, but you'd have a sense of a feeling that the ending is coming. I think for me it's similar to when you're near the end of a book. You're reading a book, and you can feel in your hand that you can see there's only a few pages left. So you know that the book is coming to an end, even though you don't know what the end of the story is. So now we're in F sharp major, anticipating the end. And after the bass leaves, the cello leaves. Then more and more of the violins, the viola, until finally only two violinists remain, playing with mutes, pianissimo, very, very quiet, almost inaudible. Now, these two violinists were actually Haydn himself, who's playing in the orchestra, and a man called Luigi Tomasini, who was the concertmaster or leader of the orchestra. They finished the work, as one writer puts it, alone and very nearly in the dark. So Luigi Tomasini, let me tell you a bit about Luigi Tomasini, because he's an important figure in this story. He was born in June in 1741 in Pesaro in Italy. He joined the Esterházy household in 1757 as a teenager, working as both a servant, general servant, and a musician. The prince sent him to Venice in 1759 for further violin training, possibly studying with a pupil of Vivaldi. He returned as first violinist of the orchestra, and when Haydn arrived, very shortly after in 1761, Tomasini was already established as the leader of the orchestra. Now, the two became very close friends over more than 30 years. They often played in string quartets together, with Tomasini on first violin and Haydn on second violin. Haydn wrote violin concertos specifically for Tomasini, including one inscribed Fatto per il Luigi, for Luigi. Tomasini was also a composer in his own right. He wrote about 30 string quartets and 24 divertimentos for the prince's beloved baritone. His family became an Esterházy musical dynasty. 4 of his 12 children became court musicians. So when those final 2 violinists played the closing bars of the Farewell Symphony, it was the Kapellmeister and his concertmaster, 2 old friends, finishing together what Haydn had started alone. So now let's try to picture the first performance of this symphony. The very first performance. First time the prince hears it. It's autumn, 1772, late October, or perhaps November, at the Esterházy Palace. So the performance would have taken place in the palace's Rococo concert salon. It's a room with white and gold walls, delicately rounded corners, a ceiling with a fresco, glass chandeliers. The room was lit by candles, which were on the musicians' music stands. Of course, that's going to be crucial to the theatrical effect coming up. Haydn leads the orchestra from the first violin, as was practice at the time. There was no separate conductor in the modern sort of sense. The audience would have been small. The prince, his family, a few other members of the court, perhaps really a few dozen people at the most. And conspicuously absent the musicians' wives, who are still back in Eisenstadt, waiting for their husbands to come home. So imagine the atmosphere as the symphony progressed. The turbulent first movement with the strange, distant but gentle, affectionate, caressing interlude. The slow movement. The minuet with its quoted lamentation chant. The furious presto of the finale, and then, like the first, again the sudden silence. The unexpected adagio with a curiously, distantly familiar, caressing, yearning theme. And one by one, the musicians stopping, blowing out their candles, packing up their instruments, walking away, and the whole symphony grounded in an extraordinarily remote key, F sharp minor and major. Distant, remote, far from more civilized keys, and the faint memory of the gentle, caressing, erotic music of the first movement, interlude and adagio ending. The prince, I think, would have understood what was happening. He was, remember, a trained musician. He knew the conventions of the symphony. He knew this wasn't how symphonies were supposed to end. And as the lights went out one by one, the music grew softer and softer. The message became unmistakable. According to accounts passed down through Haydn's early biographers, Prince Nikolaus said, "If they all leave, we must leave too." So delivered with sort of typically aristocratic understatement. He reportedly went to the antechamber to tell his musicians that they could expect the necessary carriages the next morning. The court returned to Eisenstadt the day following the performance. It worked. The musical protest succeeded, and no one had to say a word. I find myself fascinated and wondering about this. Why did it work? Why wasn't the prince offended? After all, his musicians were essentially criticising his decision to stay longer at Esterházy, his amazing, huge palace. They were saying, through Haydn's music, that they were unhappy with his command. That, I suppose, could have gone very badly. I think there are several reasons it succeeded. First, the message was conveyed with wit and with artistry. It wasn't a complaint or a whinge or a petition or something like that, something antagonistic. It was a piece of music, and a very good piece of music at that. The prince could appreciate it as art, even as he understood what it meant. Now, second, Haydn had framed the message carefully. The musicians weren't refusing to work. They weren't demanding anything. They were simply leaving. Within the fiction of the music, within the theatrical nature of the finale, they were doing exactly what musicians do at the end of a piece. They finish their parts and they go. And Haydn had found a way to make the process seem almost innocent. Now, third reason, perhaps most importantly, the prince was sophisticated enough to get the joke or get the point. A lesser patron might have missed it entirely or might have taken offence at this impertinence. But Nikolaus understood music. He understood that Haydn had done something clever and original, and perhaps he was even a little flattered that his Kapellmeister had gone to such lengths, such trouble, had composed an entire symphony to make this request. And there's also something else worth noting. The choice of F-sharp minor, that impossible key, the one that required special equipment to be made, was this part of the message too, I wonder. By choosing a key that no one else used, Haydn was signalling from the very beginning that this symphony was exceptional, that something unusual was afoot. The prince, hearing those opening bars, would have known immediately that this was not an ordinary work. As a musician, the prince might have recognized the key as being remote, exotic, distant, much like the Esterházy palace. The D major interlude in that first movement, the dreamlike sort of passage of music that is suggested again in the finale, for me, and I'm sure clearly to the prince, this represents thoughts of home, a longing for what has been left behind. I can really see that. A musical image of the wives or wags, wives and girlfriends, back home in Eisenstadt, perhaps, far away but strongly and fondly remembered. We can't know for certain really what Haydn intended. He didn't write in the music, here's the bit about the wives and the girlfriends, but I think he came as near as possible to that in the language of music. And the prince, steeped in the musical language of his time, a bit of a musical train spotter, he might well have heard such meanings in the music. He might have been looking for them right from the start, sort of accustomed to his clever court composer. Now, the Farewell Symphony achieved recognition, within Haydn's lifetime. It was performed at the Concert Spirituel in Paris on the 13th of April 1784, with the programme listing it as a symphony in which the players leave by Haydn. The Mercure de France described the finale adagio as un chant triste et lugubre, a sad and lugubrious melody. Haydn himself seems to have been proud of it. In his Symphony No. 85, written in 1785 or perhaps 1786, and it's nicknamed La Reine because it was supposedly a favourite of Marie Antoinette, he quoted the opening of the Farewell Symphony, apparently expecting audiences to recognise the reference. The work has been performed, continuously for 250 years now. It's one of the more frequently performed of Haydn's earlier symphonies, and performances usually maintain the tradition of musicians leaving the stage during the finale. Some orchestras use actual candles, others have musicians, just switch off their electric stand lights, and very often it's an incredibly theatrical experience. It remains very powerful even to this day. It's so unusual. There's actually an interesting scholarly argument about the Farewell Symphony's significance in music history. To James Webster, he wrote a book in 1991 all about the Haydn's Farewell Symphony and the whole idea of classical style. It's a very detailed book, very interesting book, and he argues that Haydn was developing techniques of through composition, cyclic integration, that are often attributed to Beethoven, because these are concepts which became much more important through the 19th century, through the 20th century as well, but he's arguing that Haydn was the real pioneer of this. The way the D major theme returns, or hinted at, transformed in finale, and these various connections of keys cycling through, the way the whole symphony as a whole seems to tell a story from beginning to end, rather than just a collection of four random pieces of music, essentially, but telling a story right from the beginning with little back references. These are innovations that anticipate Beethoven's music, particularly the Fifth Symphony, where this really happens. And that happens 35 years later. Kevin Corsine, who's another scholar, he's argued that Haydn's incorporation of a pantomime, of something theatrical, into the finale, he says this constitutes as radical a violation of generic expectations as Beethoven's introduction of a chorus in the Ninth Symphony. That's the famous Ode to Joy at the end of Beethoven's final symphony. And that's quite a claim. But there's something to it, I think. In 1772, symphonies were absolute just music without words or explicit stories, just music. And by embedding a theatrical element, a visual drama that unfolds during the performance, Haydn was breaking the rules, in a way that wouldn't be matched for decades. Right, if you want to listen to the Farewell Symphony, and I hope you do, of course you want to, here are some recommendations. Well, first, a word about recordings versus live performances. Always nice to see a live performance. The theatrical ending with the musicians leaving the stage is obviously something you can only fully experience in a live performance, or perhaps a video. On a recording, you can hear the instruments dropping out one by one, and it's effective in its own way, but you can't see, candles being extinguished, the players walking quietly away. So if you ever have the chance to hear and see this symphony performed live, take it, go and see it. So that said, anyway, there are many, many excellent recordings. One I'd recommend in particular is by Derek Solomons with the ensemble L'Estro Armonico. They're named after the old Italian expression harmonious being or harmonious genius, L'Estro Armonico. And that was also the title of a famous set of concertos by Vivaldi. So there you go. The recording was made in 1983 at St Barnabas Church in London, using period instruments, using instruments of Haydn's time. So there's a small string section, it's about 14 players, and that really allows for exceptional clarity for the woodwind instruments. It was part of a larger project, in fact, to record all of Haydn's symphonies, though unfortunately the project was, cancelled and was halted for some reason before it was completed. But this one is available to hear. I think it's a great recording. For a visual experience, I'd recommend looking up the performance by Patricia Kopachinskaya. That's with members of the Karajan Academy of the Berlin Philharmonic. You can find it on YouTube. Kopachinskaya leads the orchestra from the violin. There's no conductor, just as it would have been in Haydn's time. Everyone leaves one by one at the end while the lights are dimmed, and that's very effective. But this particular performance was made during the COVID pandemic, And the musicians, as they're leaving, they put on face masks as they leave. I think this adds an extra layer of kind of meaning and poignancy that Haydn could obviously have never imagined. A farewell in a time of plague. Kopachinskaya has actually performed this symphony several times with different conceptual framings. It's a bit of a thing that she likes to do. For her farewell concert as artistic partner with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra in 2018, she transformed the ending into a statement about climate change. Musicians laid red carnations on a black draped table as they departed, and she concluded by donning a gas mask. Quite something. So it's a reminder that great music can speak to new contexts, and you can maybe change the meaning to some extent, I suppose, carry new meanings, even 250 years after it was written. Well, as usual, I've put together a Spotify playlist, and you can search for Tim the Composer on Spotify, you should find it. I've included some of these recordings of the Farewell Symphony, but also a couple of other of Haydn's Sturm und Drang symphonies, like the Trauer and La Passione and the Lamentazione symphony that I mentioned earlier. I've also included a few pieces featuring the baritone, so you can hear what Prince Nikolaus's favourite instrument sounded like. So there we have it, a symphony in an impossible key, requiring equipment that had to be specially made, ending with the musicians walking off the stage one by one, a polite but unmistakable message from Haydn to his billionaire employer, please let us go home. And it worked. The prince understood, and the court departed the next day. I find this story, moving for several reasons. There's the ingenuity of it, the cleverness of finding a way to communicate without words, to protest without complaining. There's the relationship between Haydn and his patron, complicated but ultimately based on mutual respect and a shared love of music. There's the image of those musicians separated from their wives for months on end, turning to their Kapellmeister for help. And there's Haydn himself, who understood their loneliness because he felt it too. But perhaps what moves me most is that final image, the candles going out one by one, the music growing softer and softer, the room growing darker, until there are just two violinists left, Haydn and his old friend Tomasini, playing the last quiet notes together. A farewell that is not angry, not bitter, but gentle and beautiful. A way of saying, it's time to go home. Right, you go and listen to the Farewell Symphony on Spotify or YouTube or wherever you find your music. Or better yet, go and see if there's a live performance coming up near you and see how they do that ending. You do that, I'll go and work on the next Tim the Composer podcast. Hope you join me then for another adventure into 1,000 years of music. Bye for now.